Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well, healthy and happy. In this video I'm going to tackle yet another difficult subject. And that subject is the reality of Islamist rape gangs in the UK. Now, the mainstream media and the press are calling these groups grooming gangs. Okay? And the reason for this is because it's far easier for the public to digest that term than it is to deal with the absolute cold, hard reality that these gangs are inspired by an ideology, but we'll get into that later on. To illustrate the seriousness of the problem, I'm going to talk about the cases that have happened in the UK specifically. Now, I know that there are similar gangs operating in other countries as well. But this is a good starting point for understanding the problems that are endemic inside British society for those people that are interested in being able to do something about it. Other countries at the moment don't seem to be willing to even speak about the problem, let alone address it in any way, shape or form, legally or otherwise. So it's important that we get our facts right about what is going on. Now, this phenomenon is so widespread that you can find it in virtually any corner of the UK where there are these grooming gangs, as they're being called, but actually Islamist rape gangs set up, right? And what exemplifies this most of all is probably the most recent case, which happened in Huddersfield. On the 12th of April 2017, 24 Muslim men who were part of an Islamist rape gang were charged with the torture and mass rape of children, primarily little girls, aged between 11 and 17. These men were Abdul Rahman, aged 29, of Darnley Drive in Sheffield, who was charged with rape, trafficking, supplying drugs, supplying a controlled substance with intent to engage in sexual activity and sexual touching. There was also Nasarat Hussain, aged 28, of Upper Mount Street in Huddersfield, who was charged with 3 counts of rape, attempted rape, and inciting a female to engage in sexual activity. There was also Arfan Ahmed, aged 32, of Hughes Hill Road, in Huddersfield, who was charged with 6 counts of trafficking, sexual assault, making indecent images of a child, and inciting a child to engage in sexual activity. Zubair Ahmed, aged 30, of Blackmoorfoot Road in Huddersfield, who was charged with rape and possession of extreme pornography. You had Mohammed Rizwan Aslam, aged 29, of Huddersfield Road in Dewsbury, charged with 2 counts of rape. Mohammed Kamar, aged 32, of West View in Huddersfield, charged with 2 counts of rape. Mohammed Naman of West View in Huddersfield, charged with trafficking, sexual assault and 2 counts of rape. You also had Hamza Ali Salim, aged 37, of Seymour Grove in Old Trafford, Greater Manchester, charged with 3 counts of trafficking. There was also Zahid Hussain, aged 28, of Bland Street in Huddersfield, charged with 8 counts of rape, 5 counts of trafficking, racially aggravated assault, supplying drugs, and inciting a child into sexual activity, child abduction, and attempted rape. Mohammed Azim, aged 31, of Rose Road, Bradford, charged with 3 counts of rape. Sajid Hussain, aged 32, of Grasmere Road, Huddersfield, charged with 3 counts of rape, facilitating the commission of sexual activity on a child and inciting a child into sexual activity. Mansour Akhtar, aged 25, of Blackmoorfoot Road, Huddersfield, who was charged with rape, attempted rape, and 2 counts of trafficking. Mohammed Asaf Akram, 31, of Springdale Street in Huddersfield, charged with 7 counts of rape, 3 counts of trafficking, child abduction, supplying drugs, sexual assault, and making threats to kill. Zulwarnain Dogar, aged 29, of Central Avenue in Huddersfield, charged with sexual touching and trafficking. Manzoor Hassan, aged 37, of Bland Street, Huddersfield, charged with supply of a noxious substance with intent to injure, annoy, or aggrieve a female, supply of Class A drugs, and inciting a child into prostitution. Mohammed Ifraz, aged 28, of North Road, Huddersfield, charged with trafficking a female within the UK and with a view to her sexual exploitation, rape, false imprisonment, child abduction, taking indecent images of a child, and inciting a child to engage in sexual activity. Wikas Mahmood, aged 36, of Banks Crescent, Huddersfield, charged with 3 counts of rape. Faisal Nadim, aged 30, of Carr Green, Huddersfield, charged with supplying drugs and rape. Niaz Ahmed, aged 53, from Ned Lane, Slaithwaite in Huddersfield, charged with inciting a child into sexual activity and sexual assault. Asif Bashir, aged 32, of Thornton Lodge Road, Huddersfield, charged with 4 counts of rape and attempted rape. Mohammed Ibrar, aged 32, of Manchester Road, Huddersfield, charged with trafficking, facilitating the commission of sexual activity on a child, occasioning actual bodily harm, and supplying drugs. You also had Alim Javed, aged 27, of Everard Street, Huddersfield, charged with rape, supplying drugs, and other offences. Mohammed Saqib Rahil, aged 30, of Stour Bridge Road in Dudley, charged with trafficking and child abduction. Usman Khalid, aged 29, of Brook Street, Huddersfield, charged with sexual assault, child abduction, and sexual touching. Now, the reason that I've gone through all of the people involved in that case is because the media doesn't really want to report the individuals who were involved in it, right? This is one of the biggest problems that you'll find, is that very few people actually mention who the victims were or mention who the perpetrators were, which is far more important. The reason I talked about the victims there is because it's important that we know that these are real people. These individuals, these children that get caught up in this, are real people who experience some very real, heart-wrenching, terrible things. Like this torture that goes on, and I'm going to go into this a little bit more as we go through this video. But this is happening. It is a real phenomenon, as much as people have tried to ignore it over the past 20 years. And it's been happening for at least 20 years, probably longer, inside the UK. And it's been covered up, and we're going to get into how that cover-up took place in Rotherham as well. But it's something that nobody has been truly willing to address, except a few people who are speakers of truth, who are trying to get people to recognize that there are very, very serious things going on right now inside Britain that are not being addressed by the authorities at all, or if and when they are. It tends to be much after the fact. You see, this is the big problem. And the people who are victims, who become victims of these gangs, have already endured so much at the hands of these dreadfully evil men, right? But it is important we get a sense of these things. And it's hard to sit here and even read through the things that they've done and to try and summarize it for yourselves as well, because it does hit close to home. That's the thing. It hits close to home because we all live in countries where these kinds of things are going on, and again, because it's an uncomfortable area to really look at. A lot of people just don't want to, right? Because they're not ready, or they're not willing, or it's willful ignorance. I'm not sure really what is going on with some people. I think some individuals right now truly don't know what's going on. Others are far more malevolent in their intent, and so therefore they willfully and actively pretend that these things aren't happening when they plainly are. But that was the case in Huddersfield. Well, there was another case in Ramsgate in Kent, which was a less publicised case. And on the 26th of May 2017, a group of Afghan refugees who gang raped a 16-year-old girl above a takeaway were found guilty in a court of law. These men were Sher Shah Muslimar, aged 20, of Canterbury, restaurant owner Tamin Rahine, aged 37, of Ramsgate, Rafiullah Hamidi, aged 24, who has no fixed address, and Hamid Mohammadi, aged 18, from Way. And as I say, these were a group of Afghan refugees. So people who say that, we should just have open borders and let in refugees without any checks, without any background checks on them, without any vetting, you must be out of your mind, because you do see instances time and time and time again, and these two cases are not the only examples. There have been 4 cases in total that are major cases that have been highlighted by some form of media, but not in their totality, that have happened, right? But the radical leftists, the regressive leftists, the hard left, they don't want to face this fact that these things are happening, and the perpetrators are disproportionately and primarily men who are from Islamic backgrounds. Okay, now that doesn't mean that ethnicity necessarily is what is playing the central role in what is going on. Personally speaking, from my years of experience in understanding Islamism, I think that this is actually driven by an Islamist ideology, rather than it being race-based, which is what some people are claiming. And the people that even throw that accusation are mostly on the far left, which is strange, but there we have it. So this has got nothing to do with race. The fact of the matter is that there is an influx of people from predominantly Islamist countries who hold Islamist views, who are then perpetrating these sorts of actions. But these two cases aren't the only ones. There's a third case as well in Rochdale, which again was not as publicised as the Rotherham scandal. In Rochdale, on the 3rd of July 2017, 9 men who ran a Rochdale sex abuse ring were eventually jailed. The group exploited girls as young as 13. 8 of the men were of Pakistani origin, and 1 was from Afghanistan. Now, the only reason I'm pointing that out is because Pakistan is a predominantly Islamist country. In fact, we're seeing right now that Pakistan is starting to implement these blasphemy laws, and they are following completely and wholeheartedly the doctrine of Sharia law. So this is what they believe, and when people come in to a country that is secular, and they're bringing their old belief systems and their theocratic systems of law, which they believe should be superimposed on the population, then you do see these kinds of things happening. And I'm going to iterate why this is related to Sharia law later on. Because this is not just, and this is not something that a lot of people understand. These are not isolated incidents just happening in bubbles or in pockets, right? They're happening on a grander scale than people are willing to admit, okay? And they're happening because of an ideology, because of the beliefs that certain people hold. That is what is driving them, right? But again, we'll get into that later. So the individuals who were responsible for this particular grooming / actually Islamist rape gang were ringleader Shabir Ahmed, who was given a 22-year sentence for repeatedly raping a girl, Kabir Hassan, who was aged 25, of Oldham, Abdul Aziz, who was aged 41, of Rochdale, Abdul Rauf, aged 43, of Rochdale, who was convicted of trafficking a child within the UK for sexual exploitation, and he received 6 years as his sentence. Adil Khan, who was 42, of Rochdale, convicted of trafficking a child within the UK for sexual exploitation, who received 8 years. Now, Adil Khan also fathered the child of a 13-year-old victim. The victim was only 13 years old. There was also Mohammed Sajid, aged 35, of Rochdale, who was convicted of 1 count of rape, sexual activity with a girl under 16, and trafficking for sexual exploitation. Mohammed Amin, aged 45, of Falling, who was convicted of sexual assault and received a 5-year jail term. There was also Hamid Safi, then aged 22, of No Fixed Address, who was convicted of trafficking girls for the sole purpose of sexual exploitation. He came into the UK, by the way, on a lorry in 2008 and claimed asylum. There was also, finally, Abdul Khayyam, aged 44, from Rochdale. So that's 3 cases which have had major impacts on the communities that these incidents took place in. And there are hundreds of victims, if not thousands. Okay. Now, one of the numbers that's being floated around right now with regards to this, I was going to get into this a little bit later on, but this is kind of important to mention, that one of the numbers that's being floated around, which I've quoted myself, is the 1,400 girls as potential victims that have not that have not sought the help of authorities, right? That haven't come into public view, shall we say? Well, that's only true for Rotherham. Okay, that number of 1,400 victims only applies to Rotherham. Now, if you consider the 3 cases that we've talked about, and we're going to talk about the 4th, which is Rotherham, in a second, but if you consider the number of people involved in the first case we were mentioning in Huddersfield, where 24 men were involved in this Islamist rape gang, think about what that means. How many victims must there have been? Why do I ask that question? I ask that question because if we have 1,400 victims from Rochdale, and Rochdale was perpetrated, they tell us, by 5 men, according to the convictions and the sentences that were handed down, then how many victims must there be for Huddersfield? Is that something anyone will be willing to speak about, or will that be covered up as well? So let's talk about Rotherham. In October 2010, 8 Muslim men were tried at Sheffield Crown Court for sexual offences against girls aged between 12 and 16. 5 men were convicted, including 2 brothers and a cousin. The men were Razwan Razak, aged 30, for sexual activity with a child; Umar Razak, aged 24, for sexual activity with a child; Zafran Ramzan, aged 21, for rape and sexual activity with a child; Mohsin Khan, aged 21, for sexual activity with a child; and Adil Hussein, aged 20, for sexual activity with a child. So they were all child rapists. And similarly with the previous case there we were talking about, again, mass instances of child rape. Okay? This is the rape of children that we're talking about, really, in real terms. Little girls. Okay? I want you to seriously think about that if you haven't already. Okay, because this is not the way that the media is portraying this. In fact, the media has been portraying this because they've been trying to put their own spin on it, as media do, right? As the media always does. The way they're portraying it is that these victims must have been over the legal age of consent. They never almost mention, right? They almost never mention that the victims in this were children. Okay. And when they do mention it, the idea that they put across is that these kids came from care homes. Okay, that the victims are all from care homes and that they're just the rejects of society or some garbage like this. In my opinion, no child is a reject of society, nor should any of us ever think that. Right? But even if look, that's simply not true that the victims were from care homes or these orphanages, or whatever new term you want to spin on that and call them whatever you wish, right? These care facilities or whatnot, child services, whatever. The fact of the matter is that many, many, many of these victims were living with their parents. Okay? They were living with their parents. And, you know, the way that the media spun this is absolutely astounding, because they found a way to ignore the victims, to re-victimize the victims in a great many ways, by pretending that they don't matter, or that these were isolated cases, or that the only people involved in this were the men that were convicted. What about the men that weren't? What about the men that engaged in all this sexual activity with with these children? You see, there's another question. Did the police ever do anything about them? No. Okay? And, you know, when these things were brought to the attention of the authorities by the victims, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on as well, but when these things were brought up, the authorities dismissed the victims. And not just dismissed them in the sense of, well, you know, whatever. No. They dismissed them in the sense that they looked upon them derogatorily. Okay? And again, I will talk about that a little bit. But another related incident that happened with regards to Rotherham was the case of Laura Wilson. Okay? Again, not a lot of people know about this because it's just not being spoken about. Right? God bless the people that are doing something about this, that are saying something about it, right? But they're not even talking about this. Laura Wilson, who was aged 17 at the time of her death, was stabbed 40 times and thrown into a canal by her 17-year-old boyfriend, Ishtiaq Asghar. And the police called this an honour killing, dignifying it. Okay? The thing with Laura Wilson was that she was assessed as having an IQ of only 56, meaning that she had learning difficulties. And how is this relevant with regards to Rotherham? Well, Wilson had been the target of localised grooming gangs, these Islamist rape gangs, from at least the age of 11. Okay? Now, Asghar was eventually jailed for 17 years and 6 months, right? He was eventually convicted for her murder. But the blatant behaviour of the British police in dealing with this matter, the absolutely disgusting way in which they completely ignored anything that was going on with regards to these rape gangs because of political correctness and cultural sensitivities, is disgraceful. And recently, Labour MP Sarah Champion came out publicly to say that as many as 1 million children may have been victimised by Islamic rape gangs across the country. And she's being ignored right now as well. Right now, she's getting an average of 10 victims per week seeking her help. Okay? Now, alongside that, former Victims Commissioner Louise Casey, who was part of the IPCC investigation, released an inspection report on Rotherham's rape gangs. Cases contained in Casey's report are very highly disturbing. One concerns an alleged rape with a broken bottle. This is torture. This is not just rape. This is not just about sex. This is not just about the exploitation of kids. This is the absolute destruction of childhood, of children, of the innocence of children. Please try and understand this if you don't already. Okay? And I'm getting upset just thinking about this and reading this, but we do have to talk about it. Girls, according to Casey's report, were also being ordered to kiss the feet of perpetrators at gunpoint. One girl had her tongue nailed to a table. A mind-numbing 61 pregnancies were attributed to rapes. Children were sexually exploited by men who came largely from the Pakistani heritage community. Again, that's relevant because, again, the ideology that drives these men is what is important, not their ethnicity. The report stated not enough was done to acknowledge this, to stop it happening, to protect children, to support victims, and to apprehend perpetrators. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure that out, because it was allowed to go on for years and years. Inspectors further noted that council members bullied victims with a witness insisting the council viewed those victims as little slags. That's a direct quote. This is what I was talking about when I was saying that they look down on the victims. Okay, there's this classism, this elitism, which is endemic again in the offices of these authority figures, right, of these actual institutions. And again, the report does reveal that the police refused to believe the young girls on numerous occasions. The girls themselves, in Rotherham specifically, but I'm sure in many other cases as well, were threatened with being charged for wasting police time. They were told that they had consented to sex, and on occasion they were arrested at the scene of the crime rather than the perpetrators. The kids were arrested at the scene of the crime by the police. Okay, I mean, this is just shocking, the scale of this thing. And that was in 2010, right? And we've had all these recent cases that have been investigated, and we've had all these convictions delivered recently as well. But these things are still going on, and they're increasing in frequency. They're still going on, right? The Islamist rape gangs are operating unfettered even now, because there's far more people involved in them than just the people that have been convicted. And they were convicted because there was enough evidence for it, obviously, right? But there are countless others that will never be found, that will never be charged, because the victims will obviously be worried, well, if we come forward, which happened with Rotherham, which happened with Rochdale, which happened with Huddersfield, right, and the other case we were speaking about, all these victims are not believed by the police. And if they are believed, the police are afraid that they'll be labelled as being racist. That's a big problem. It's a very serious problem. This PC culture is damaging the criminal justice system in a very, very serious way. Okay? It's disabling our services, in a sense, from being able to do what they need to do. But this didn't just happen again in a vacuum, right? The reason all these things are going on and are continuing to happen is because of corruption, not only at the highest levels, which is going on, right? The corruption and the desolate souls, if you will, of the people in power, that's certainly allowing much of this to happen, but this is also something that exists in the lower echelons, right? The local authorities, the local councils. You see? So it's a massive, massive problem that nobody really wanted and even now wants to tackle. Okay, and kids are suffering as a result of this, right? As I say, this is not just about rapes going on, which are horrendous enough, rapes against children, right? But it's also about the torture that is involved in many of these instances. Broken bottles being used and kids' tongues being nailed to tables. My God, this is in the official reports. You can read this for yourself. Okay? That is what is going on. And why is it happening? You see, Peter McLaughlin covered this in his book Easy Meat. He talks about this, right? And for years, nobody wanted to know about this phenomenon. And now Mr. McLaughlin is being smeared by the hard left for pointing out facts. The BBC recently, because of the enormous public pushback which happened, decided to air a documentary based on Mr. McLaughlin's book. But they still haven't fully addressed the problem. Why is this happening? Well, obviously because the people involved in it are evil men, right? They are evil individuals, right? And some women were complicit in this as well, by the way, who were also from Islamist backgrounds. I didn't get a chance to go into that here, but that's also happening. They're enabling these men to carry out these attacks. You can look that up through the links that I'll provide below as well. But it is an ideology that's driving these people to do this. And an example of this would be the Quranic texts. For example, Surah 4:3, which gives them the impetus to do these kind of things. Okay, and until people understand that the texts are driving them, that the way that the texts are being interpreted are driving them, that the way that that they're being taught to carry out what is basically a massive rape jihad against the West by targeting children and by targeting vulnerable children specifically, that is something, again, nobody wants to talk about. Because the ideological component, again, makes for an uncomfortable truth. Then you have to face the fact that, oh, hang on a second, Islam or Islamism, the ideological offshoot, the derivative, is what's responsible for it. And Islamism basically adheres to Sharia completely and utterly and wholly in all its forms, right? And again, there are passages in the Reliance of the Traveller, which is the definitive book on Sharia law in Islam, right, which support these actions. So, very serious questions indeed for many, many people. But nobody wants to talk about them. And even I find it difficult, as you've been able to tell, to even just get through this video, to really talk about these things, because they're heartbreaking. You know, and seeing the mass level at which these things are taking place, the sheer numbers involved of both victims and perpetrators is disheartening, because nobody seems willing to do anything about it. And the question fundamentally we have to ask is, why is it that British people don't want to face this? Right? Why is it anyone that brings any of this up, all these things which have happened factually, definitively, truthfully, provably, which have happened, anytime anyone brings this up, they're called a bigot, they're called a racist, they're called this, they're called that, and nobody wants to talk about the reality of the situation which is going on. And the ones that do get shut down by the hard left. It beggars belief, you know? And the majority of the population just doesn't want to know. They're suffering from what Professor Gad Saad calls the ostrich parasitic syndrome. I hope I've got that right. But they genuinely just bury their heads in the sand and pretend none of these things are going on. As if these things eventually aren't going to affect you or your children or someone you know. See, that's the big mistake people are making. They're ignoring it because they think, it's nothing to do with us. And they're just joining in with the mob mentality of screaming all kinds of epithets at people who want to try and do something about the problem. Instead of going, hold on a second, these things are happening, let's try and find out why. You see, it's much easier just to join in with the mob than it is to think for yourself. You know? But it is an endemic problem. And we're nowhere near getting a handle on it, by the way. If what Sarah Champion says is true, and there are about 1 million victims of these terrible, horrendous crimes, 1 million children who have been caught up in it, we're nowhere near dealing with it. You know, what does that say about our country when we're willing to sacrifice the well-being and the welfare of our children to protect a religious ideology, to protect perpetrators of these crimes? What does that say about us? You see, these are big questions. And very few people, again, want to answer them. And I don't... See, one person can't do much about any of these things, no matter who that person is. There are a handful of really active people right now, right? And there are a handful of those people doing something about all of these things. People like Gad Saad, people like Jordan B. Peterson, people like Stefan Molyneux, Lawrence Southern, right? Tommy Robinson. They're going out there and they're speaking about these things in the face of all the criticism. I'm going out there and speaking about all these things in the face of all the criticism, right? And very, very few people are willing to take what anyone with any sense is saying on board. So how do you combat a problem like that? You know, how do you do it? Can it be done if the public doesn't want to wake up? If the public wants to stay asleep to all these atrocities going on around them? You know, the British public is completely asleep at this point in terms of the majority of the people, right? They're completely asleep. They don't care. They want to pretend these problems don't exist. And they'll keep pretending these problems don't exist until their country is burning all around them. Because that's already happening in Sweden, it's already happening in France, it's happened in Austria, it's happened in Germany. Well, we're just going to be the next in a long line of countries that fall down. Because, again, people are not willing to do whatever is necessary. People don't have the courage to stand up and do something about these things. To challenge the police, for example, in terms of why they haven't acted on these cases. People aren't challenging their governments. People aren't challenging anyone who is responsible for this debacle, right? Who is responsible for these atrocities. They're just not challenging anyone about these things. And people's lives are being destroyed in the process. Children's lives are being destroyed in the process. Kids are getting murdered. Laura Wilson, I'm sure, is not the only one. So, I don't know what people want me to say about this, really, because I'm at my wit's end, to be honest with you. I can't see how Britain can ever be saved from itself. Okay? And when I talk about Britain, I'm talking about Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. I'm talking about all these countries. If all the parts of these countries don't want to save themselves, if they don't want to push back against the machinations of their governments, of the shadow power brokers, if they don't want to do any of these things, there's nothing anyone can do. Okay, and I hate to sound so utterly pessimistic about this, but there's nothing anyone can do if you don't do something yourselves. And I'm not talking about, by the way, don't take my words out of context on this, I'm not talking about violence, because I'm completely opposed to violence. Violence being physical force or physical duress being applied against someone who has not aggressed against you. Self-defense is a completely different matter. Let me reiterate that, by the way. Self-defense is very necessary. Okay, and self-defense extends, I think, to your direct personal sphere. Okay, that's my belief on that. So if somebody in your family, for example, is the victim of a crime, not necessarily as abhorrent as these crimes, but any kind of crime, then I personally believe that you have a right to retaliate if you feel that they are in danger. And the law also, by the way, recognizes that. Or at least it's supposed to, right? So, self-defense is a whole different matter, but I'm not advocating violence. What I'm advocating is that people become active in any way, shape, or form. Speak about these things, challenge the people who are responsible for it. I'm doing that, other people are doing that, but we're a handful of people. If the population of the UK stands at 60-odd million, how many inside that population have really challenged their government for their abhorrent behaviours? For their absolutely atrocious handling of these things? Very few, if any. And you can probably name all the people that have. And that's a bad sign. If you can name everyone who's standing up against totalitarianism, who's standing up against authoritarianism, who's speaking out about these rape gangs, who's speaking out about terrorism, if you can name those people, that's a really bad sign. Because it means that nobody else is doing anything. Okay? And that's the problem. Because ultimately, if you just allow the decay and the degradation of your society to continue to a point where it's irreparable, then the only thing that's ever going to get you out of that kind of situation is a violent confrontation, a violent revolution, a violent civil war. That's what it comes down to at that point. And it becomes very bloody. You see, and we're fast approaching that. I hate to tell you all this, but we are fast approaching that. And that's my biggest worry. It's my biggest concern right now. Because we're not addressing the things that need to be addressed as a nation. I'm not talking about you guys out there, my viewers, right? I'm saying, look, we're not truly, as a people, as a society, as a country, addressing any of this. And it's not just the UK. Take a look at Sweden, take a look at Germany, take a look at what's going on there right now. Okay, those countries have completely been demolished. right? They've been completely taken over by ideologues, by people who conform to ideologies, right? They're completely invested in those ideologies. So there's very little hope of things improving unless people themselves start understanding their own self-sovereignty and their own personal sovereignty. And I'm not just talking about pockets of individuals. I'm saying everybody has to do that. Or at least as many people as possible. There have to be people numbering in the tens of millions. Tens of millions of people would have to be awake to reality. And that's just not happening. And in the meantime, you've got kids suffering. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there because it's too difficult a subject to tackle and do it justice in its fullest sense, you know. And I don't think I've done it justice in this video completely, to be honest with you. But it's just so damned important to talk about it, to say what's going on, to speak up, to speak the truth about what the heck is going on, what is driving these people that commit these crimes. You know. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless you.